There is a moment most people experience at some point in their lives, a quiet, unsettling moment where they look at the choices they've made, the relationships they've maintained, the career they've built, the life they're living, and they realize, with a kind of cold clarity, that very little of it was actually chosen for themselves. It was chosen for someone else, for a parent, for a partner, for society, for the version of themselves they thought the world wanted to see. And in that moment, a question arises, one of the most important questions a human being can ask, which is, who am I actually living for? That question is the starting point of everything we're going to talk about today, because the psychology of living for yourself rather than for others is not a simple topic. It is not about selfishness. It is not about disconnecting from the people you love. It is not about becoming cold or indifferent to the world around you. It is something far more nuanced, far more difficult, and far more important than any of those things. It is about understanding the deep psychological mechanisms that cause human beings to abandon themselves in favor of external approval, and then slowly, carefully, deliberately learning to reverse that process. Let's start at the beginning. Human beings are social creatures. We are wired, at a neurological level, for belonging. The need to be accepted by a group is not a weakness. It is a survival mechanism that kept our ancestors alive on the African savanna for hundreds of thousands of years. Being cast out from the tribe meant death. Being accepted meant safety, food, protection. So the brain learned very early in our evolutionary history to monitor the reactions of other people constantly, to adjust behavior based on social feedback, and to experience genuine pain. Emotional pain that activates the same neural pathways as physical pain when we are rejected, criticized, or excluded. This is important to understand because it means that the tendency to live for others is not a character flaw. It is not a sign of weakness. It is baked into your biology. The question is not whether you care what other people think. You do, and you always will, to some degree. The question is whether that biological tendency has grown so dominant that it has completely overwritten your ability to know and honor your own desires, your own values, your own sense of self. And for a remarkable number of people, it has. The research in developmental psychology is very clear on this. By the time most children are 5 or 6 years old, they have already begun to suppress aspects of their authentic emotional experience in order to maintain parental approval. A child who learns that expressing anger makes their parent withdraw affection will begin to suppress their anger. A child who learns that being sad makes their parent uncomfortable will learn to perform happiness even when they don't feel it. A child who learns that having big dreams makes the adults around them nervous or dismissive will begin to shrink those dreams to make them more modest, more acceptable, more invisible. This process is so gradual, so normal, so universal that most of us don't even realize it happened. We think the suppressed version of ourselves is the real version. We have been performing so long that we've forgotten there was ever a self underneath the performance. The psychologist Carl Rogers called the authentic self the organismic self, the part of you that knows at a felt bodily level what it actually wants and needs and values. And he observed that the core tragedy of modern psychological life is the growing gap between the organismic self and the self-concept, the image of who we think we should be, which is constructed almost entirely out of other people's expectations and evaluations. When that gap is small, you feel whole. You feel like yourself. When that gap is large, you feel fragmented, anxious, numb, or exhausted. You might describe it as feeling lost or empty or like you're going through the motions. What you're actually experiencing is the psychic cost of maintaining a self that isn't yours. Now here is where it gets psychologically fascinating. The human mind doesn't simply experience this gap passively. It creates very sophisticated defense mechanisms to manage the discomfort of that gap. One of the most common is what psychologists call other-focused living, the pattern of investing enormous energy in managing other people's emotions, anticipating other people's needs, performing roles that earn external validation, and organizing your entire internal life around the question of how other people are perceiving you. People who live primarily for others often experience this as virtue. They tell themselves, and often genuinely believe, that they are simply being considerate, generous, selfless, caring. And on the surface, they often are those things. But underneath, if you look carefully, there is a transaction happening. The giving is not entirely free. It is tied to a hope, sometimes conscious, often unconscious, of receiving approval, love, safety, or at the very least, the absence of conflict and criticism. The giveaway is in how it feels when that approval doesn't come. When you have given and sacrificed and accommodated, and the people around you are still not satisfied, still critical, still ungrateful. If you feel devastated, resentful, profoundly depleted, that is the signal. That is the evidence that the giving was not purely generous. It was a survival strategy, and survival strategies, when they stop working, feel like catastrophe. This is not a condemnation. This is a description of something almost universal. Most of us learn to manage our anxiety through some combination of people-pleasing, perfectionism, overachievement, or self-erasure. The specifics vary. The underlying mechanism is the same. We are trying to feel safe in a world where we have come to believe that our authentic self is not acceptable. So the first step in the psychology of living for yourself is simply understanding this, not as an intellectual concept, but as something you can feel in your own experience. Can you identify the version of yourself you perform for the world? Can you notice the gap between that performed self and the quieter, stranger, more complicated, more real person underneath? Most people, when they sit with this question honestly, can feel it. There is a version of you that is careful, appropriate, curated. And there is a version of you that is something else entirely, rawer, more uncertain, more alive. The second step, and this is where it becomes genuinely difficult, is recognizing the internal voice that enforces the performance. Psychologists call this the inner critic, or the superego, or the internalized parent. Whatever you call it, you know it. It is the voice that tells you you're too much. The voice that says, "Who do you think you are?" The voice that reminds you of every time you failed, every time you were rejected, every time your authentic expression was met with disapproval. It is not your enemy. It was once trying to protect you. But it has outstayed its welcome. It is no longer protecting you from real danger. It is protecting you from the discomfort of being fully yourself, which is not the same thing at all. One of the most transformative things a person can do is simply begin to observe this voice without obeying it. Not to argue with it, not to try to eliminate it, just to notice it. To hear it say, "People will judge you if you say that," and then to pause and ask, "Is that actually true? Is it true that everyone will judge me? Is it true that their judgment will destroy me? Is it true that their comfort is more important than my honesty?" When you start asking those questions genuinely, the voice begins to lose its automatic authority. This is the work that happens in good psychotherapy, not the dramatic catharsis of uncovering repressed memories, but the quiet, persistent practice of noticing the self-censoring mechanisms and asking whether they are still necessary. Whether the beliefs that drive them are actually accurate, whether the person you are performing for is even still in the room, because often they're not. Often we are performing for parents who are long dead, or for a version of society that no longer exists, or for a self-image we constructed when we were 8 years old and terrified. Now let's talk about what living for yourself actually looks like in practice, because I think there's enormous confusion about this. There is a popular cultural narrative, particularly in certain corners of the self-help world, that living for yourself means optimizing for your own pleasure and comfort, cutting off people who challenge you, and generally treating your own preferences as supreme. I want to be very clear, that is not what I mean, and it is not what the research supports as psychologically healthy. Living for yourself does not mean being indifferent to others. In fact, the psychology of genuine selfhood shows us that people who have a strong, secure sense of their own identity are consistently more capable of deep, authentic connection with others, not less. When you know who you are, when you have access to your own genuine values and desires, when you have stopped performing a curated self, you can actually meet other people. You can be genuinely curious about them. You can love them without needing them to validate you. The paradox of authentic selfhood is that it creates the conditions for real intimacy. What living for yourself means, psychologically, is something more precise and more demanding than mere self-indulgence. It means learning to make decisions from your own internal compass rather than from anticipated external approval. It means being willing to disappoint people in service of what you genuinely believe is right or true. It means tolerating the discomfort of being misunderstood rather than contorting yourself to be misread in a way that at least feels safe. It means having preferences. It means having opinions. It means having boundaries that come from your actual values rather than from what you think will make other people comfortable. And let's be honest, it means accepting that some people will not like it. This is, for many people, the hardest part. We have spent so long organizing our self-presentation around the goal of universal likability that the idea of being genuinely disliked, not through misunderstanding or accident, but because we simply showed up as ourselves, feels unbearable. The brain registers it as threat. The old survival wiring kicks in. Every instinct says, recalibrate, apologize, accommodate, smooth it over. The work is to feel that instinct, recognize it for what it is, a biological alarm system responding to social friction as though it were mortal danger, and then choose differently. Not because you don't care about other people, but because you have decided that the cost of abandoning yourself is higher than the cost of being disliked. There is a concept in psychology called the locus of control, and it is deeply relevant here. People with an internal locus of control believe that their experiences are primarily determined by their own choices and actions. People with an external locus of control believe that their experiences are primarily determined by forces outside themselves, other people's behaviors, fate, circumstance. Research consistently shows that an internal locus of control is associated with better mental health outcomes, greater life satisfaction, stronger resilience in the face of adversity, and higher levels of what psychologists call self-efficacy, the belief that your actions can actually make a difference. When you live primarily for others, you are operating, almost by definition, from an external locus of control. Your emotional state is dependent on how other people respond to you. Your sense of worth rises and falls based on external feedback. You are, in a very real sense, outsourcing the regulation of your own inner life to people who don't have access to it, who don't fully understand it, and who have their own preoccupations and their own distortions that have nothing to do with you. Reclaiming an internal locus of control is one of the central tasks of psychological maturation. It doesn't mean ignoring feedback. It doesn't mean refusing to be influenced. It means developing what the psychologist David Riesman called inner directedness, a stable, internalized set of values and commitments that guides your choices regardless of what the social environment is currently rewarding or punishing. Let's talk about a specific and very common manifestation of living for others, the approval addiction, because that's essentially what it becomes for many people. An addiction. The neurological mechanisms are quite similar. When you receive social approval, a compliment, a like on social media, an expression of admiration, your brain releases dopamine. It feels good. It feels briefly like enough. And then it fades and the need returns and you begin organizing your behavior around getting the next hit. Like any addiction, this one escalates over time. The amount of approval that used to feel sufficient starts to feel inadequate. You need more of it from more people in more domains of your life. And like any addiction, the pursuit of it begins to crowd out other things: genuine connection, honest self-expression, the quiet satisfactions of doing things that matter to you rather than things that perform well for an audience. Social media has made this a crisis-level problem in the contemporary world. The platforms are quite literally engineered to exploit the approval-seeking circuitry of the human brain. And the result is that millions of people are now engaged in a continuous, exhausting performance of their lives, curating their experiences, filtering their appearance, shaping their opinions, not for themselves, but for metrics, not living, but broadcasting, not experiencing, but displaying. The antidote to approval addiction is not cynicism or withdrawal from connection. The antidote is what researchers call intrinsic motivation, the capacity to engage with activities, relationships, and projects because they are genuinely meaningful to you, independent of external reward or recognition. When you are intrinsically motivated, the quality of your engagement changes fundamentally. You become absorbed rather than self-conscious. You become curious rather than performative. You become genuinely present in your own life rather than a spectator of your own self-presentation. The research of psychologists Edward Deci and Richard Ryan on self-determination theory shows us that human beings have three core psychological needs: autonomy, the sense that your actions arise from your own genuine choices; competence, the sense that you are growing and developing genuine capabilities; and relatedness, the sense of meaningful connection with others. And crucially, their research shows that when people pursue goals primarily for external reasons, for money, status, or approval, they tend to experience less of all three, even when they achieve the goals. The external rewards actually undermine the intrinsic satisfaction that would otherwise be available. This is why so many people who achieve the things they thought they wanted, the prestigious job, the impressive relationship, the Instagram-worthy life, still feel empty. They organize their pursuit around external validation rather than genuine desire, and the achievement, when it arrives, feels hollow because it answers a question they weren't actually asking. So how do you begin? If you've spent years, perhaps decades, organizing your life around external approval, how do you start to locate your own genuine desires and values? How do you find the self that got buried under all those layers of performance? The first practice is what I would call radical honesty with yourself in private. Not with anyone else, just with yourself. You begin to ask yourself questions that you have perhaps been avoiding. What do I actually enjoy? Not what I post about enjoying, not what sounds like the kind of thing a person like me should enjoy, but what genuinely absorbs and delights me. What do I actually believe? Not what I was raised to believe, not what my social circle expects me to believe, but what my own experience and reflection leads me to. What do I actually want my life to look like? Not the version that would impress my parents or my peers, but the version that, at the end of it, I would feel was genuinely mine. These questions are harder than they sound. For people who have been performing for a long time, the honest answers are sometimes very far from the performed life. That gap can be frightening to confront. But it is infinitely less frightening than arriving at the end of your life and realizing you lived it for an audience that is long gone. The second practice is learning to tolerate your own emotions without outsourcing them. People who live for others are often very dependent on other people for emotional regulation. When they feel anxious, they need reassurance. When they feel uncertain, they need validation. When they feel sad, they need someone to make it stop. This is not a character flaw. It is the result of never having learned to sit with difficult emotions, because in childhood, those emotions were either punished or rescued, never simply allowed to exist and be felt. Learning to tolerate your own emotional experience, to feel uncomfortable feelings without immediately seeking to escape them through approval-seeking, people-pleasing, or self-distraction, is foundational to psychological autonomy. It is the basis of everything else. Because when you know you can handle your own emotional experience, you no longer need the world to be arranged in a certain way to make you feel okay. And when you no longer need the world to be arranged for your comfort, you become free in a way that is genuinely difficult to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. The third practice, and this one is uncomfortable, is beginning to make small, low-stakes choices based on your own genuine preference rather than on anticipated approval. Not dramatic gestures, not grand declarations of independence. Just, what do I actually want to order? What do I actually think about this topic? What would I wear if I weren't performing for anyone? These small choices are the practice field. Each one is a tiny act of self-reclamation, and over time, they aggregate into a life that actually belongs to you. And the fourth practice, which undergirds all the others, is developing what the psychologist Kristin Neff calls self-compassion, the capacity to treat yourself with the same kindness and understanding you would extend to a person you genuinely care about. Because the reason most of us started performing in the first place is that we didn't believe our authentic selves were acceptable. We believed we needed to be better, smoother, different, more impressive before we deserved to take up space. Self-compassion is the direct challenge to that belief. It says, you are already acceptable, already worthy of care, already enough, not because of what you achieve or how you perform, but simply because you exist. This is not a passive or complacent stance. Self-compassion does not mean lowering your standards or giving up on growth. Research consistently shows that people with high self-compassion are actually more motivated to improve and take on challenges than people who rely on harsh self-criticism. The difference is the motivation. Self-compassionate people improve because growth is genuinely meaningful to them. Harsh self-critics improve when they do, out of fear of inadequacy. And that motivation is both psychologically costly and ultimately unsustainable. There is one more dimension of this that I want to address before we close because I think it is often left out of these conversations, and it is important. Living for yourself is not a destination you arrive at. It is a daily practice, a continuous orientation, a choice you make over and over again in the face of the very strong biological and social pressures that will keep pulling you back toward performance, toward approval, toward the comfortable known territory of living for others. There will be days when you slip back. There will be relationships where the pull toward people-pleasing is almost irresistible. There will be moments when the old voice comes back with full force and you capitulate, and then feel the familiar mixture of temporary relief and slow-burning resentment. That is not failure. That is being human. The question is not whether you will ever fall back into old patterns. You will. The question is whether you have the self-awareness to notice when it's happening and the commitment to your own genuine life to keep returning again and again to the person you actually are. Because here is what I believe and what the best of psychological research supports. You are not here to be palatable to everyone. You are not here to earn your place in the world through endless accommodation and self-erasure. You are not here to be a well-curated version of what you think other people can handle. You are here, briefly, irreplaceably, in a way that will never happen again, to live your own particular, unrepeatable experience of being alive. And the deepest tragedy is not failing at other people's standards. The deepest tragedy is succeeding at them so completely that you never find out what your own life would have looked like. That is the work. Not easy, not finished, but worth every difficult, disorienting, liberating step.